There are moments in history when a single image changes everything, when the comfortable illusion of progress shatters against the brutal reality of truth, when a mother must choose between private grief and public witness. This is the story of one such moment. In September 1955, a mother named Emmett Till Mobley stood before an open casket in Chicago's Roberts Temple Church of God in Christ. Inside lay her only child, 14-year-old Emmett Lewis Till. What she saw was so horrific that she fainted. When she regained consciousness, she made a decision that would alter the course of American history. She would not hide her son's body. She would not allow a closed casket. The whole world, she decided, needed to see what hate had done. "Let the people see what they did to my boy," she said. Over the next 5 days, between 50,000 and 100,000 people would file past that casket. Black families brought their children. They wanted them to understand. They wanted them to remember. And when Jet magazine published the photographs of Emmett's mutilated face, the images traveled across the world, forcing a reckoning that could no longer be avoided. This is not just the story of Emmett Till's death. It is the story of his life, his mother's unimaginable strength, and the spark that ignited a revolution. It is a story of how a whistle became a watershed, and how one woman's refusal to remain silent became the conscience of a nation. Emmett Louis Till was born on July 25, 1941, in a Chicago lying under the shadow of a world at war. His father, Louis Till, was a soldier who would never return from Europe, executed by the army in Italy under circumstances shrouded in controversy and classified silence. Emmett would grow up knowing his father only through stories and a single silver signet ring engraved with the initials LT. His mother, Emmett Till Mobley, was a force of nature wrapped in elegance and determination. Born in the Mississippi Delta herself, she had escaped north during the Great Migration, joining the flood of black Americans fleeing the suffocating terror of Jim Crow. In Chicago, she had remade herself. She worked as a clerk for the Air Force, one of the few professional positions available to black women at the time. She was educated, articulate, and fiercely protective of her only son. Emmett, whom everyone called Bobo, was the center of her universe, and what a universe he inhabited. Chicago's South Side in the 1940s and 1950s was a world unto itself. Bronzeville, as the neighborhood was known, pulsed with life. Jazz clubs, churches, barbershops, corner stores, the smell of fried chicken and cornbread wafting from kitchens, the sound of gospel music on Sunday mornings and blues on Saturday nights. Here, black families owned businesses. Black children went to integrated schools. The police were still a threat, discrimination still a daily reality. But there was breathing room. There was possibility. Emmett grew up in this world of relative freedom. He was a charming boy, always laughing, always the center of attention. He had his mother's intelligence and his own natural charisma. He loved to dress well, carefully selecting his clothes, making sure his shirt was pressed just right, his shoes polished to a shine. He had a sweetness about him, a kindness that drew people in. His cousins remembered him as generous, always willing to share whatever he had. But Emmett's life had not been without struggle. At age 5, he contracted polio during the epidemic that swept through Chicago. It was a terrifying time for Mamie, watching her young son fight the disease that had paralyzed and killed so many children. Emmett survived, but the illness left its mark. He developed a slight stutter, especially when he was excited or nervous. Some sounds were harder for him than others. His mother taught him a trick. When he got stuck on a word, he could whistle to relax his throat, to reset his breathing, and then continue speaking. That stutter never dimmed his personality. By 14, Emmett was robust, stocky, with an easy smile and an easier laugh. He was 5 feet 4 inches tall and weighed about 150 pounds, solid and strong. He worked part-time jobs, saved his money, and loved treating his friends and family. He was, by all accounts, a good kid, a normal kid, a kid who told jokes, played pranks, and dreamed about the future. He was also a kid who had never lived in the South. He had never experienced the full weight of white supremacy. He understood poverty. His family had known lean times. He understood discrimination. Chicago was hardly a racial paradise, but he did not understand terror. He did not understand that in the world his mother had fled, a black boy's life could end for the smallest perceived transgression. He did not understand that in Mississippi, the rules were not just different, they were deadly. The journey to money. The summer of 1955 was sweltering. Chicago's heat was oppressive, the kind that made the pavement shimmer and the nights restless. Emmett was looking forward to something different, something exciting. His great-uncle, Moses Wright, known to everyone as Mose or Preacher, was heading back home to Mississippi after visiting family in Chicago. Mose was a sharecropper and a part-time preacher in the tiny hamlet of Money, Mississippi, deep in the heart of the Delta. He was a quiet, dignified man, small in stature but large in faith. Emmett begged his mother to let him go. He had cousins down south he had never met. He wanted an adventure. He wanted to see something new. Mamie resisted. Every instinct she had screamed against it. She knew Mississippi. She had been born there, in the small town of Webb, and she had spent her childhood watching the brutal machinery of segregation grind lives into dust. She had seen black men lynched for looking at a white woman. She had heard the stories of bodies found in rivers, of families who disappeared in the night. But Emmett was insistent, and Mamie, like so many mothers, wanted to believe that things had changed. It was 1955. The Supreme Court had ruled on Brown versus Board of Education just the year before. Perhaps, she thought, the South was beginning to bend toward justice. Perhaps her son would be safe. Still, she was afraid. The night before he left, Mamie sat Emmett down for a conversation he would never forget. She looked into his eyes and told him the truth about the place he was going. She told him that in Mississippi, black people had to be careful. They had to watch every word, every gesture, every glance. She told him that white people in the South were not like white people in Chicago. She told him that if a white person confronted him, he must humble himself. He must say, "Yes, sir," and "Yes, ma'am." He must lower his eyes. If necessary, she said, her voice breaking, he should get on his knees. She told him that his life depended on his obedience. Emmett listened. He nodded. But Mamie could see in his eyes that he did not truly understand. How could he? He was 14 years old. He had never known a world where such submission was required. He promised her he would be careful. He promised her he would follow the rules. Before he left, Mamie gave him a gift. It was his father's signet ring, the silver ring engraved with the initials L.T., Lewis Till. It was one of the few physical connections Emmett had to the father he had never known. The ring was too large for his fingers, but Emmett wore it anyway, proud to carry this piece of his family history. On August 20th, 1955, Mamie took Emmett to the 63rd Street station. She walked him to the platform. She hugged him tight, tighter than usual, as though some part of her knew this was goodbye. She watched him board the Illinois Central Railroad, heading south. She watched the train pull away, carrying her son into a world she had spent her life trying to escape. The journey was long. The train rumbled through Illinois, through the flat farmlands, then into Missouri, through Kentucky, through Tennessee, and finally into Mississippi. As the train crossed the state line, the world changed. The air itself seemed different, heavier, thick with humidity and history. The rules changed too. Black passengers were directed to separate cars. Signs appeared, whites only, colored. The invisible lines that governed life in the South became visible and absolute. Emmett arrived in Money, Mississippi on August 21st. Money was not a town in any real sense. It was a crossroads, a collection of a few dozen buildings scattered along a dirt road. Cotton fields stretched in every direction, endless and flat. The landscape broken only by the occasional cypress tree or the distant line of the Tallahatchie River. The heat was crushing. The sun beat down with a vengeance, and the air was so humid it felt like breathing water. Mose Wright's home was a small, three-room sharecropper's cabin set in the middle of a cotton field. It was simple, sparse, with unpainted wooden walls and a tin roof that turned the house into an oven during the day. There was no running water, no indoor plumbing. Life here was hard in a way that Emmett, for all his understanding of poverty, had never experienced. But Emmett adapted. He met his cousins, Maurice, Simeon, Wheeler Parker, and others. They were good kids, close in age, and they took to Emmett immediately. He entertained them with stories about Chicago, about the city lights, the tall buildings, the freedom to walk wherever you wanted. They listened with wonder. Emmett also went to work in the cotton fields. Picking cotton is brutal labor. You bend over, dragging a heavy sack behind you, pulling the bolls from the plants under the relentless sun. The cotton itself cuts your fingers, your back aches, your legs cramp. After a few days, Emmett's hands were raw, his body exhausted. The work humbled him quickly. This was a different world, and he was beginning to understand that. August 24th, 1955 was a Wednesday. It was another hot, sticky day in the Delta, the kind where the heat makes you move slow, where even the insects seem to drone lazily. Emmett and a group of his cousins and local teenagers had finished their work in the fields. They had a little money in their pockets, earned from picking cotton, and they wanted to spend it. Someone suggested they go to Bryant's grocery and meat market, a small store in Money that sold sodas, candy, and other sundries. The group piled into a car. There were about 8 or 9 of them, laughing, joking, looking forward to a cold drink. Bryant's grocery was a simple building, a wood-frame structure with a covered porch and a Coca-Cola sign hanging out front. It was owned and operated by Roy and Carolyn Bryant, a white couple. Roy was often away on business, and Carolyn usually ran the store alone or with help from her sister-in-law. The teenagers parked outside, and several of them went inside. Emmett was among them. Accounts of what happened next have varied over the years, shaped by memory, fear, and the passage of time. But the core facts, corroborated by multiple witnesses, are these. Emmett and a few others entered the store. Carolyn Bryant was behind the counter. She was 21 years old, attractive, and accustomed to the deference that white women in the South received from black men and boys. Emmett, for his part, was used to the integrated world of Chicago. He had white classmates, white teachers, white neighbors. He did not carry the ingrained fear that his southern cousins lived with every day. Inside the store, Emmett bought some candy. There are conflicting accounts about whether he spoke to Carolyn, whether he touched her hand when she gave him his change, whether he said something that could be interpreted as flirtatious. What is certain is that when Emmett left the store, he turned back and let out a loud, sharp wolf whistle. The sound cut through the humid air like a gunshot. For Emmett, it may have been a joke, a bit of bravado in front of his cousins. For the black teenagers standing outside, it was an instant, visceral shock of terror. They knew, immediately and instinctively, that Emmett had crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. In the South, a black boy did not whistle at a white woman. He did not look at her too long. He did not speak to her unless spoken to. These were the unwritten laws, and the penalty for breaking them was not a fine or a jail sentence. The penalty was death. The boys panicked. They grabbed Emmett and hustled him into the car. They drove away quickly, their hearts pounding. Wheeler Parker later recalled that they were terrified, that they knew something terrible had just happened, but they also hoped, desperately, that maybe nothing would come of it. Maybe Carolyn Bryant would say nothing. Maybe Roy Bryant would never find out. Maybe, just maybe, they could all forget this ever happened. For a few days it seemed like their hopes might be realized. Emmett continued to pick cotton. He joked with his cousins. He seemed unaware of the danger. But the black community in Money knew. Word had spread. People whispered. Some suggested that Emmett should be sent back to Chicago immediately, before Roy Bryant returned from his trip. But Mose Wright, a man of faith and perhaps of naivety, believed that nothing would happen. He believed that they were safe. He was wrong. Roy Bryant returned to Money on August 27th. He had been on a shrimping trip to Texas, gone for several days. When he arrived home, his wife Carolyn told him what had happened. The exact nature of her account has been disputed. In later years, she would recant parts of her testimony, admitting that she had lied. But in August 1955, she told her husband that a black boy from Chicago had insulted her, had made advances toward her, had grabbed her and spoken to her in a way that was unacceptable. For Roy Bryant, this was not just an insult to his wife. It was an insult to him, to his manhood, to the entire structure of white supremacy that he and men like him were determined to uphold. In the twisted logic of the Jim Crow South, a black boy whistling at a white woman was an act of rebellion, a challenge to the social order, and in Roy Bryant's mind, such a challenge could not go unanswered. Bryant went to see his half-brother, J.W. Milam. J.W., whose full name was John William Milam, was an imposing figure. He stood 6 feet, 2 inches tall and weighed over 230 pounds. He was bald, with a face that seemed carved from stone. He was a decorated veteran of World War II and the Korean War, a man who had seen combat and had no qualms about violence. He owned a small store and some land, and he had a reputation in the Delta as someone you did not cross. Together, Roy Bryant and J.W. Milam began to plan. They were going to teach this boy from Chicago a lesson. They were going to remind him, and anyone else who might forget, that this was Mississippi, and in Mississippi, black people knew their place. Over the next day, they gathered information. They found out where Emmett was staying. They enlisted the help of at least 2 other men, possibly more, though the identities of these accomplices would never be fully confirmed. They armed themselves, and they waited for darkness. The night of August 27th into the early morning of August 28th was hot and still. In Mose Wright's small cabin, the family was asleep. Emmett shared a bed with his cousin Simeon. Other cousins slept in the adjoining room. The only sounds were the chirping of crickets, the distant croak of bullfrogs from the river, and the occasional creak of the wooden floorboards settling in the heat. At 2:30 in the morning, the sound of a vehicle pulling up outside shattered the silence. Then came the pounding on the door, heavy, insistent, the sound of men who expected to be obeyed. Mose Wright woke instantly, his heart already racing. He knew. Somehow he knew. He walked to the door in his nightclothes. When he opened it, he saw 3 white men standing on his porch. 2 of them had flashlights. All of them had guns. J.W. Milam stepped forward. He was the one in charge. His voice was cold, flat, utterly devoid of emotion. "Preacher, you got 2 boys from Chicago here?" Milam asked. Mose Wright's mouth was dry. He nodded. "Yes," he said. "He had boys from Chicago." "I want the boy who done the talking," Milam said. Mose tried to plead. He said the boy was young, that he didn't know the ways of the South, that he meant no harm. Milam cut him off. "How old are you, preacher?" Milam asked. Mose told him, 64. Milam leaned in close, his voice dropping to a whisper. "If you make any trouble, you'll never live to be 65. The men pushed past Mose into the house. They went into the bedroom where Emmett and Simeon were sleeping. They shined their flashlights in the boys' faces. "Which one of you is the one from Chicago?" one of them demanded. Emmett, groggy and terrified, admitted that he was. The men grabbed him, yanking him out of bed. Emmett was wearing only a t-shirt and pants, no shoes, no jacket. He tried to get dressed, but they wouldn't let him. They dragged him toward the door. Mose Wright followed, pleading. He offered to pay them money. He offered to take whatever punishment they thought was necessary himself. The men ignored him. At the door, one of them turned back. "You better not tell anyone about this, old man," he said, "or you'll be next." Outside, there was a truck waiting. A woman's voice came from inside the cab. "Is that the right one?" she asked. The men pushed Emmett closer. "That's him," one of them said. The woman confirmed it. This was the boy. They loaded Emmett into the back of the truck. He looked back at his uncle, his eyes wide with fear. And then the truck pulled away, its headlights cutting through the darkness, carrying Emmett Till into the night. Mose Wright stood in his doorway, shaking. He was terrified, not just for Emmett, but for himself and his family. He knew the power these men held. He knew that if he went to the police, he might be signing his own death warrant. But he also knew he couldn't do nothing. As soon as the sun came up, he would go to the sheriff. He would report what had happened. He would try to save the boy. But deep down, Mose Wright knew it was already too late. What happened to Emmett Till over the next few hours is almost impossible to comprehend. The details were later revealed through the confessions of Roy Bryant and J.W. Milam, published in Look magazine after their trial. They spoke with a chilling casualness, as though describing a hunting trip rather than the torture and murder of a child. The men drove Emmett to a barn in Drew, Mississippi, about 30 miles from Money. The barn was remote, far from any main road, a place where screams would go unheard. Inside, they began to beat him. They wanted a confession. They wanted him to admit that he had done wrong, that he had insulted a white woman, that he understood the gravity of his mistake. But Emmett, terrified as he was, did not grovel. According to Milam's account, Emmett remained defiant. When they demanded he beg for mercy, he refused. When they beat him, he did not break. Milam later said he was surprised by the boy's courage, even angered by it. He showed no fear, Milam said. He didn't even cry. They pistol-whipped him with a .45 caliber handgun. The blows shattered his skull. They broke his teeth. They gouged out one of his eyes. The violence was methodical, sustained, an orgy of cruelty designed to utterly destroy the boy. And when they were finished, when Emmett Till was barely recognizable as human, they decided he had to die. They dragged his broken body back to the truck. They drove to the Tallahatchie River, a slow-moving, murky waterway that wound through the delta. At the riverbank, they shot Emmett in the head. The bullet entered above his right ear, killing him instantly, if he was not already dead from the beating. To ensure the body would sink, they used barbed wire to tie a 75-pound cotton gin fan around Emmett's neck. The fan was a heavy, industrial piece of machinery used to separate cotton fibers from seeds. It was a cruel irony. The very instrument of the South's economic power, built on the labor of enslaved and exploited black people, now used to weigh down the body of a murdered black child. They rolled Emmett's body into the river. It disappeared beneath the surface, swallowed by the dark water. The men stood there for a moment, watching, making sure the body stayed down. Then, they got back in their truck and drove away, back to their lives, back to their families, confident that they had committed the perfect crime. After all, in Mississippi in 1955, the murder of a black boy by white men was hardly a crime at all. When Mose Wright went to the sheriff's office on the morning of August 28, he was met with skepticism and hostility. The sheriff, H.C. Strider, was a large man who owned several cotton plantations. He was a product of the Delta, steeped in its racial hierarchy. He listened to Mose's story with barely concealed contempt. Still, the law required him to investigate, if only to maintain appearances. Sheriff Strider and his deputies went to the homes of Roy Bryant and J.W. Milam. The men admitted they had taken Emmett Till from Mose Wright's house. They claimed they had only wanted to scare the boy, to teach him a lesson. They said they had driven him around for a few hours and then released him. They had no idea where he was now, they said. Maybe he had run away. Maybe he had gone back to Chicago. They shrugged, unconcerned. Strider arrested them, but more as a formality than anything else. He placed them in jail, but the charges were vague. Kidnapping, perhaps, nothing more. And as the hours passed, it became clear that the sheriff's office was not interested in a thorough investigation. They were interested in protecting their own. Meanwhile, in Chicago, Mamie Till Mobley was frantic. She had received a phone call from Mose Wright, his voice shaking, telling her that Emmett had been taken. She immediately began calling everyone she could think of. She called the NAACP. She called the local newspapers. She called the State Department. She demanded that someone do something, that someone find her son. The response was maddening. Officials told her to be patient. They told her that Mississippi authorities were handling it. They told her not to worry, that Emmett had probably just run off. But Mamie knew better. She knew Mississippi. She knew what happened to black boys who crossed the line. And she knew, with a mother's terrible intuition, that her son was already dead. For 3 days she waited. 3 days of phone calls, of sleepless nights, of a growing dread that settled in her chest like a stone. And then, on August 31st, a fisherman named Robert Hodges was checking his trot lines in the Tallahatchie River near the town of Phillip, when he saw something floating in the water. At first he thought it was a log, but as he drew closer he realized it was a body. The body of a young black male, bloated and disfigured, with a cotton gin fan tied around the neck with barbed wire. Hodges reported his discovery to the authorities. Sheriff Strider arrived at the scene. He examined the body briefly, and then made a decision. He ordered the body to be buried immediately, that very day, without embalming, without a proper autopsy, without even attempting to notify the family. He claimed the body was so decomposed that it posed a health risk. In truth, he wanted to bury the evidence, but before the burial could take place, someone had to identify the body. Mose Wright was brought to the riverbank. He looked at the corpse, swollen and mutilated, almost unrecognizable. But then he saw something. On one of the fingers there was a ring, a silver signet ring, engraved with the initials LT. It was Lewis Till's ring. It was the ring Mamie had given Emmett before he left Chicago. Mose Wright confirmed the identification. This was Emmett Till. The boy's body was loaded onto a wagon and taken to a funeral home in the nearby town of Greenwood. Mississippi officials planned a quick burial in a local cemetery. They wanted this whole affair to disappear. But they had not counted on Mamie Till Mobley. When Mamie received the telegram informing her that her son's body had been found, she collapsed. The news was not unexpected, but the confirmation of it was a blow that nearly destroyed her. Her only child, her Bobo, was dead. He had been murdered in the most brutal way imaginable. Mississippi officials informed her that the body would be sent to Chicago, but they insisted on one condition. The casket must remain sealed. They claimed the body was too decomposed, that it would be unbearable for her to see. They wanted to spare her, they said, but Mamie knew the truth. They wanted to hide what they had done. They wanted to bury the evidence along with her son. Mamie refused. She demanded that the casket be opened. She demanded to see her son. And when the casket arrived at the train station in Chicago, accompanied by her uncle and several NAACP officials, Mamie was there, waiting. The casket was taken to the A.A. Rayner funeral home on the south side. Mamie insisted it be opened immediately. The funeral director tried to warn her. He told her it would be too much, that she should remember Emmett as he was. But Mamie was resolute. She needed to see. When the casket lid was lifted, Mamie looked inside, and what she saw broke her. The body was so mutilated, so disfigured, that it was barely human. Emmett's face was swollen to twice its normal size. His head had been battered so severely that his skull was crushed. One eye was gouged out, hanging from its socket. His tongue was protruding. There was a bullet hole above his right ear. The body was decomposed from 3 days in the water, the skin blackened and bloated. Mamie fainted. When she came to, she was sobbing, her body racked with grief. But then, through the tears, a clarity came over her. She understood what she had to do. This was not just her private tragedy. This was a crime that demanded witness. The world needed to see what Mississippi had done to her son. The world needed to see the true face of racism, of hatred, of the violence that Black Americans lived with every single day. "Let the people see what they did to my boy," she said. "Let the world see." It was an extraordinary decision, one that required unimaginable strength. Mamie Till Mobley was giving up her privacy, her right to grieve in peace. She was turning her son's mutilated body into a symbol, a rallying cry, a piece of evidence in the court of public opinion. She knew that the images would be horrific. She knew that people would be traumatized, but she also knew that only by confronting the horror could anything change. Mamie arranged for the funeral to be held at the Roberts Temple Church of God in Christ, a large church on the south side of Chicago. She insisted on an open casket. She invited the press, and she opened the doors to the public. The response was overwhelming. Beginning on September 2nd, thousands of people began to line up outside the church. They stood in the hot sun, waiting for hours just to file past the casket. They came in families, parents holding the hands of their children. They came alone. They came in church groups, in neighborhood associations, in a spontaneous outpouring of grief and rage. Over the course of 5 days, an estimated 50,000 to 100,000 people viewed Emmett Till's body. They walked through the church in silence, their faces stricken. Many wept openly. Some gasped. Some turned away, unable to look. But they all saw. They all bore witness. The black press was there in force. Photographers from the Chicago Defender, from Jet magazine, from Ebony took pictures. They captured the casket, the body, the grieving mother, and then they published those images. Jet magazine, in particular, made the decision to print a full-page photograph of Emmett in the casket, his face clearly visible in all its horror. The images were shocking, almost unbearable to look at. But that was the point. These were not abstract images of violence. This was not a statistic. This was a child, a real child. And this was what hatred looked like. The photographs spread across the country. They were reprinted in black newspapers, passed from hand to hand, shown in churches and community centers, and they reached beyond America, published in newspapers around the world, becoming a symbol of American racism that the United States could not deny or hide. White America, for the most part, tried to look away. Mainstream white newspapers largely ignored the story or buried it in the back pages. But Black America saw, and they remembered. The images of Emmett Till's body became seared into the collective memory of a generation. They became a call to action, a reminder of what was at stake, a symbol of the violence that the civil rights movement was fighting against. Emmett Till Mobley stood at her son's funeral and gave a eulogy that was both heartbreaking and defiant. She spoke of Emmett's life, his kindness, his laughter, his dreams, and she spoke of his death, of the injustice, of the need for change. Emmett was a sacrificial lamb, she said. His death will not be in vain. The murder of Emmett Till had become a national and international story. The NAACP was demanding justice. Black newspapers were calling for federal intervention. The pressure was building, and Mississippi authorities could not simply ignore it. On September 6th, a grand jury in Tallahatchie County indicted Roy Bryant and J.W. Milam for murder. The trial was set to begin on September 19, 1955, in the town of Sumner, Mississippi. Sumner was a small delta town, the county seat, with a courthouse that sat on a town square surrounded by cotton fields. The trial would be a spectacle, a demonstration of power, and a message to anyone who thought that Mississippi's racial order could be challenged. From the beginning, the trial was a farce. The courtroom itself was segregated. Black spectators, including Emmett Till Mobley and the journalists from the black press, were forced to sit in a separate section at the back of the room. The jury was composed of 12 white men, all of them farmers or businessmen from the county, all of them products of the same culture that had produced the defendants. There were no black jurors. Under Mississippi law at the time, black citizens were systematically excluded from jury service. The judge, Curtis Swango, was a local man, a former state senator. The defense attorneys were a team of 5 lawyers, all prominent in the Delta, all determined to defend the honor of white Mississippi. The prosecutors, while ostensibly seeking justice, seemed almost apologetic, as though they were embarrassed to be bringing charges at all. Roy Bryant and J.W. Milam sat at the defense table, relaxed and confident. They chewed gum, they smoked cigars, they smiled at their wives who sat in the front row. They showed no remorse, no fear. They knew the game was rigged in their favor. The national press was there, reporters from major newspapers and magazines, sensing that this trial was about more than just a single murder. It was about the entire structure of segregation, about whether the South could continue to operate under its own rules, immune from the laws that governed the rest of the nation. The prosecution's case rested largely on the testimony of Mose Wright. He was the only witness who could definitively place Roy Bryant and J.W. Milam at the scene of the kidnapping. But calling Mose Wright to the stand was an extraordinary risk. For a black man to accuse a white man of a crime in a Mississippi courtroom was almost unheard of. It was an act that could, and often did, result in retaliation, violence, even death. Mose Wright knew the danger. He had been urged by friends and family to leave Mississippi, to flee to Chicago before the trial, but he refused. He had made a promise to Mamie. He had made a promise to Emmett. He would tell the truth, no matter the cost. On September 21st, on the morning of his testimony, the courthouse in Sumner was packed beyond capacity. Every seat was filled, and the air was thick with heat and tension. White men in hats crowded the front rows. Black spectators, including Emmett Till Mobley and members of the black press, were forced to sit in the balcony, far from the jury's view. Reporters from across the country filled every available space, their pens ready to capture history in the making. When Mose Wright was called to the stand, the room fell silent. He was 64 years old, thin and weathered from a lifetime of hard labor. He wore his best Sunday suit and a black hat that he removed respectfully as he took the oath. His voice trembled at first, but his eyes were steady. The defense lawyers watched him like hawks. They were men who carried the full weight of white Mississippi's expectations on their shoulders, and they intended to humiliate him, to break him, to remind everyone in that courtroom of where power truly lay. But Mose Wright had already decided that fear would not rule him anymore. He recounted the events of that night in calm, deliberate tones. The knock at the door, the men with guns, the flashlight beam, the truck waiting in the dark. He told them how the men had taken Emmett, how they had threatened to kill him if he spoke a word. He described the woman's voice that had come from the truck. Every word painted a picture the jury could not ignore, no matter how much they wanted to. Then came the moment that would echo through history. The prosecutor asked, "Mr. Wright, do you see in this courtroom the men who took your nephew that night?" The room seemed to stop breathing. Mose Wright turned his head slowly toward the defense table. Roy Bryant and J.W. Milam sat there, relaxed, smirking slightly, certain that no black man would ever dare point a finger at them. But Mose Wright did. He lifted his arm and extended his finger. His voice was clear, unwavering as he said, "There he is." It was a simple phrase, spoken in his Delta accent, heavy with years of fear and faith, but it struck the courtroom like thunder. Reporters would later write that it was one of the bravest moments they had ever witnessed in the Jim Crow South. For the first time in living memory, a black man had stood in a Mississippi courtroom and directly accused a white man of murder. The white spectators murmured angrily. The defense attorneys shifted uncomfortably. Bryant and Milam stared at him with cold contempt. But Mose Wright didn't flinch. He stood tall, his dignity unbroken, his conscience clear. In that instant, he represented something far greater than himself. He was every black man who had ever been silenced, every family who had ever buried their dead without justice. When he left the stand, the room was still heavy with tension. Everyone knew that the outcome of the trial might not change, but something had shifted. A line had been crossed that could never be uncrossed. Courage, once seen, could not be unseen. Outside, reporters rushed to send their stories north, and the black press would soon publish headlines calling Mose Wright the bravest man in Mississippi. He returned home under the watch of armed friends, uncertain what the night might bring. But he had done what he came to do. He had spoken the truth in the face of death, and though the men he accused would walk free, the sound of his voice, "Thar he is," would echo through generations, a testament to the quiet, unstoppable power of truth. Perfect. Here's the continuation, written in the same cinematic, historical documentary tone as the rest of your Emmett Till story. For 5 long days, the trial of State of Mississippi versus Roy Bryant and J.W. Milam dragged on under the sweltering Delta sun. Reporters described the courthouse in Sumner as a theater of contradiction, where the law was on display, but justice was not invited. Inside, fans spun lazily from the ceiling, barely cutting the heavy heat. The defense lawyers cracked jokes. The spectators laughed when they should have mourned. Outside, cotton bales swayed in the humid breeze as though mocking the proceedings within. The evidence was overwhelming. Mose Wright had identified the men. A ring with Emmett's father's initials, L.T., had been found on the body. The men had admitted to taking the boy from the house. Yet in the courtroom of 1955 Mississippi, truth itself was not admissible if it threatened the order of white supremacy. The defense's strategy was simple and sinister: deny, distort, and dehumanize. They claimed the body found in the Tallahatchie River wasn't Emmett Till's at all. They argued that the corpse was too decomposed to be identified. They insisted that the NAACP had planted the story to stir racial unrest. One of the lawyers even said in open court, "If that's the body of a Negro boy, it's not the same Negro boy." Each statement was an insult to logic, but in that courtroom, it worked. The jury, 12 white men, nodded, not in reason, but in recognition of their shared creed. They weren't protecting Bryant and Milam. They were protecting themselves. The defense called Carolyn Bryant to the stand. The courtroom grew quiet. Her soft voice trembled as she told her story, that Emmett had grabbed her hand, made lewd remarks and whistled at her. She played her part perfectly, the fragile Southern woman, the victim of imagined defilement. The all-white, all-male jury listened with sympathy, even though her story had already changed several times. No one questioned her contradictions. No one dared. Mamie Till Mobley sat in the back of the courtroom, silent but resolute. Every word was a knife, but she refused to look away. She watched the men who had stolen her son's life smirk and chew gum. She watched a system bend itself backward to protect them. And she knew, with a pain deeper than any wound, that this was not about evidence. It was about power. On September 23, 1955, after 5 days of testimony, the jury was sent out to deliberate. They left their seats, walked to the jury room, and returned just 67 minutes later. When asked why it had taken so long, one juror joked, "We would have been faster, but we stopped to drink soda pop." Their verdict? Not guilty. The words echoed in the courtroom like a second death. Mamie closed her eyes. Mose Wright lowered his head. Reporters scribbled furiously, capturing disbelief in ink. Some jurors even walked up to shake the hands of the defendants. Laughter broke out. J.W. Milam's wife cried tears of relief, not for the dead boy, but for her husband's freedom. The trial was over, but the shame was only beginning. A few months later, safe under the protection of Double Jeopardy, Roy Bryant and J.W. Milam sold their story to Look magazine for $4,000. In a chilling confession published in January 1956, they admitted to the murder in full detail, how they had beaten Emmett, shot him, and dumped his body in the river. They told the story with no remorse, no shame, and no fear of consequence. America read their words and could not look away. The world saw Mississippi for what it was, a place where a child's life could be taken without penalty, where murderers could pose for photographs and sell their story like a trophy. But what the killers didn't realize was that their confession had done something extraordinary. It turned Emmett Till into a symbol no one could silence. In Chicago, in Montgomery, in Harlem, and across the South, his name became a whisper that grew into a movement. Just 3 months later, when Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat on a Montgomery bus, she later said, "I thought of Emmett Till, and I couldn't go back." The courtroom emptied, but the weight of what had happened lingered like smoke that refused to clear. Mississippi went back to its cotton and its silence. Bryant and Milam returned home as free men, their laughter echoing down the dusty Delta roads. But something had shifted, something they could not see, could not kill, and could not bury. In their arrogance, they believed they had silenced a boy, but they had awakened a generation. Across the country, people who had once watched quietly began to speak. Black mothers held their sons tighter. Black fathers clenched their fists harder. The world had seen the truth, and the truth would not go back into the river. Emmett Till's body was laid to rest, but his name became immortal. His story became a mirror America could no longer turn away from. And though justice did not come from that Mississippi courtroom, it came later, in marches, in voices, in courage born from his mother's pain and his uncle's defiance. Because even in death, Emmett Till refused to be forgotten.